So the easiest micro livestock to do in an urban setting are going to be things like chickens, rabbits, and ducks. Even I've heard people raising guinea pigs. I know that might not be socially acceptable in North America, but one of the most common meat products in South America is actually guinea pig. And so it's really interesting when you're in an urban context and you're growing a garden. You don't have a lot of space to grow food in, and in fact you end up kind of in a situation where, you know, a lot of the stuff that's growing are things like this. There's weeds here. This is a dandelion green. And you can actually eat dandelion, and this is probably pretty good because it's in the shade. It's a bit tough. There are definitely some cultivars of dandelion that are better than others, but it's not bitter yet. Like, this would actually make a... Oh, there's the bitterness. That's pretty bitter. However, bunnies and ducks, like anything that likes to graze on green stuff, basically, bunnies, ducks, guinea pigs, even geese, I wouldn't recommend that in an urban context, but they have the ability to turn biomass that humans can't consume into things that humans can consume. And even if you choose not to eat those animals, the other thing that they do is they'll turn this into a usable fertilizer. And so you can take the productivity of a garden at least twofold just by having micro livestock. Now, there's always the concern of bylaw, and bylaw is just basically a funny set of laws that have emerged and they're really just a symptom of how sick our society is. Like, when you get into cities, we're so disconnected as neighbors, we're so poor at communicating with each other that we can't go over to our neighbor and actually tell them that we have an issue with how they're managing their yard and that it's causing harm to our yard. And so we end up having these bylaw officers who are basically just arbitrators. And so bylaw is mostly just something that you have to acknowledge if you're scared that your neighbors are going to tell on you. And so the best way to manage bylaw is to get to know your neighbors and become friends with them and start to kind of use an old Aboriginal idea. I was reading a book on, I think it was Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And there's this story of this guy living in the north, this Western kind of European guy, and he was almost starving. And one day he showed up and he looked outside of his front door, and he was kind of in the middle of nowhere. He was living with Inuit, or in an Inuit kind of community. And there was a dead walrus on his doorstep, and some guy had dropped it off because he knew that this guy was starving because he didn't have enough food. And this Western guy went to the Inuit community and said, "Oh man, I need to pay you back." And the Inuit put a knife to his neck and basically said, "Don't you ever offer to try and pay me back again." He's like, "One day I'm gonna need you to drop a walrus on my doorstep, and I don't want, I actually want to have this little micro debt between you and me, because that's how we create resilience in our communities." And so as cities have gotten larger and it's easier to become to kind of like blend into the background and for nobody to know you. Like, one thing that happens when you live out in the country is everybody's watching over your stuff. And so it kind of seems like it's a bit gossipy sometimes. But really what's going on is they're watching what cars are going down the street. They're making sure that nobody's going to come steal your stuff. They're looking out for you. And that's just kind of a survival mechanism for living out here. But in the cities, we're, what's the word I'm looking for?
Disconnected?
We're disconnected, but there's like nobody knows who you are. What's the word I'm looking for?
Anonymity?
We have anonymity, yeah. So like, you can do things that aren't very nice in a city and no one will ever know about it. And if they ever do find out about it, you can just leave, not be friends with those people, and find another 10 people to be friends with, because there's so many people living in a small space. In a country environment like this where the population's really low, you can't do that. And so the result of that lack of connection are bylaw officers. And then all of a sudden, bylaw officers give your neighbors and the people in your community more agency over the land that you've purchased than you have. So get to know your neighbors, and if you want to maximize the production on your garden, obviously grow a garden, grow a food forest, but get animals, get micro livestock that don't need expensive feeds, that can live off of the byproducts of the garden that you're not going to consume. Weeds, grasses, things that normally would go into a compost bin can first go through an animal, be turned into eggs, meat, feathers, manure, labor, and then the excrement from those animals can then go into the compost, so you still are able to capture that, that cycle, but you get way more yield out of it if you move it through a few more cycles first before it ends up in the compost heap.